It will be easier.
Hello, I just want to first thank Professor Menashri and Tel Aviv University for inviting us all and inviting me. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to talk about the Iranian women's rights movement, but my own research is only about contemporary stuff. But the university wanted me to give a broader view, so I'm going to try to do that, and then get to what I work on, which is the contemporary stuff. So to start with, Iranian history up to the recent time has been his story. And thanks to the efforts of researchers such as, and I thought some of them would be here, but they're not, people like Afsaneh Najmabadi or Elise Sanasarian, or the activists, feminist activists that we have in Iran today, who have published extensively on the subject. We now have a different view and a different interpretation of what went on in Iranian history with regard to women. There are certain characteristics about the women's movement. There are 100 years. It's a 100 years old movement. Obviously, like any other social movement, it had its up and downs, and during the war or other social upheavals, there was not much happening. But it has been going on for the past 100 years. It has always used nonviolent strategies, even though it has been met at times with violence, has existed in different forms in various cities in Iran, but unfortunately most of the research on this topic has been heavily Tehran-centered, and I'm afraid I'm going to be guilty by association. There's no one movement. There's a spectrum of activism with various goals and objectives. And most often when we talk about one social movement, there is a tendency to represent that and, as the women's movement, and I certainly do not want to do that. What I will talk about is only one trend. During the constitutional revolution between 1905 to 1911, we now know that there was a women's movement alive at that time. Or what I should say, the inception of a movement. During the constitutional revolution, Iranian women were active in the constitutional revolution. They had cooperation with progressive nationalism at that time. There was a major force in mobilizing women's groups. Women's rights activists in this category has always included feminist men. As you all know, this is the case in much of the Middle East, in Egypt and elsewhere as well. Along with nationalists, were unified against foreign powers' intervention in their country. The early feminist movement in Iran concentrated very much on women's education and their active participation in society. After constitutional revolution, feminists such as Sadiqeh Dolatabadi, Maryam Amid, Banu Amir Sehi Mah Sultan, these people established independent women's newspapers, schools, and what we call women's anjumans, or organizations. Sadiqeh Dolatabadi was a constitutionalist herself and a women's rights activist who established Anjuman Mukhaddarat Vatan in 1911, as well as an independent women's newspaper, Zaban Zanan. I should mention that the Islamists destroyed her grave during the 1978-79 revolution, but fortunately 3 years ago, the new generation of Iranian feminists, to whom I will return at the end of my talk, established a library named after her, and it is functioning at the moment, and it works as a great archival center and a library for anyone who is interested in doing research. In 1910, the Danish newspaper was published by Dr. Kehal. Maryam Amid was the editor of the same paper in 1914. Shukufe magazine in the same era was also a paper that criticized women's religious and superstitious beliefs. Now, at this period emerged a trend of thought among Iranian women's rights activists that equated modernity with the West and was highly critical of indigenous religious women. This trend continues to this day, and it remains to be a troubling aspect of women's movement in Iran, because there's always a perspective that we don't want what exists in Iran, we don't want what is associated with the religion, and these things will keep us back. I'm sure this is very familiar to those who study Iran. You know that this trend is alive, and so it is also alive in women's rights movement. Objection to imposed hijab was another theme in these newspapers. Name Banwan, edited by Shahnaz Azad, for instance, was critical of Islamic hijab, imposed and encouraged by the clergies. And I should also mention that we have just begun to see the researchers who do research on the Iranian women who were also objecting to the Unveiling Act of 1936 by Reza Shah to unveil women of Iran. Up to the Pahlavi regime, we had known only about the jubilation of women to be, and how happy they were to get rid of the hijab. But we just recently have begun to see more research on the topic that says that that shows a lot of women were not happy because obviously it was imposed, and many religious women didn't want to be unveiled. Many girls' schools were established after the Constitutional Revolution, and this caused many clergies to oppose women's rights activism because they were against female education. Namus, established by Tubi Azmude in 1907, ترقی بنات by محروخ گوهرشناس, تربیت نسوان by انجمن مخدرات وطن. These were the newspapers that advocated women's education. And before then, or at this time I should say, there was also cooperation between clergies and women's rights activists, but on the topic of the women's education there were always controversies, because there was a faction of the Ayatollahs and the clergies who opposed women's education because they thought these are it would advocate fasad, moral corruption in society. But obviously that was not the view of all clergies. We did have progressive clergies, as we do now in Iran, who are very much for women's rights within the Islamic context. Now, in Pahlavi era, 1935-1936, Reza Shah, as you all heard yesterday from Professor Milani and others, was very much affected by what happened in Turkey, Ataturk, Turkey, and so he imposed unveiling to make Iran a modern nation. And as I said, it created a problematic power dynamics that continues to trouble Iranian women's rights activists to this day, because he politicized the issue of hijab. The clergies claim that the regime is using women and it is un-Islamic, and the women's rights issue became a symbol of Western manipulation and intervention in Iran. During the years of 1941 to 51, where parts of Iran was occupied by the foreign powers, we still had newspapers by women. Jamiyat Zanan was established, which declared its independence. Its publication was Ruznameh Zan, which was banned in 1945. This time you had Tudeh Party's women's faction. This is the major leftist organization in Iran, established its own women's party. And they published a newspaper, Bidari Imam. In 1944, the Pahlavi regime established its own women's party that was pro-Pahlavi. In 49 to 53, the Mossadegh era, he was able, the Prime Minister Mossadegh, who nationalized oil in Iran, was able to make a wide coalition of socialists, nationalists, and Islamists. And women's groups proposed various gender equality bills to the parliament in order to demand equal rights. They were able to gather 100,000 signatures to support their bills. And I always think about this counterfactual question: what would have happened to women's issues and gender equality if the 1953 coup by CIA had not happened? What would have happened to Iranian women's rights, because they were very active and they were able to pass gender equality bills in the Majlis. In 1956, Pahlavi regime created شورای جمعیت‌های بانوان ایران and شورای عالی جمعیت زنان ایران, which were closely affiliated with the Shah and the Shah's sister Ashraf. In 1962, the White Revolution was initiated by Shah. One of the items was to grant women the right to vote. The clergy opposed the White Revolution, and Shah was forced to have a referendum. On March 9th, it was ratified via a referendum. And so the women's right to vote was given to them via a referendum. In 1971, Shah's regime established National Organization of Women. And I believe at that time there were only 2 countries in the world that had a national organization of women. One was Italy, and the other one was Iran. Internationally, the Pahlavi regime was under lots of pressure. In 1958, the monarchy next door in Iraq was toppled, and President Kennedy had given the Middle Eastern countries an ultimatum to democratize their countries. Incidentally, this is when Iran and Israel became 2 rival states that competed in receiving the American support. This set the context for the Iranian Revolution, and I'm now going to switch to what happened after the revolution. As you all know, in that period, during the revolutionary time, the women's questions were very much not an issue, I should say. The leftist groups involved in the up to the Iranian Revolution did not want to deal with women's issue, and they always thought that it should be dealt with after the revolution. The Islamists thought that we have way more important stuff that we have to deal with. The nationalists had the same view. So I think it's a correct statement to say that all the groups and political factions involved in the Iranian Revolution pretty much agreed to postpone Iranian women's rights till after the revolution. And in February 26, 1979, Khomeini announced the family protection law was banned and dismantled. And so these were the early signs that Khomeini showed in trying to deal away with the way the Pahlavi regime had dealt with the women's rights and had issued bills and imposed laws for women's liberation from the top. In 1983, hijab became mandatory, so once again it was politicized, and the secular women were vehemently crushed at that time. So then we have the emergence of what some have called Islamic feminism during this era. This is where we have Zahra Nahnavard, Masume Ebtekar, and other people who established a trend in Iran, which some people have called Islamic feminists, and some have said that this is a contradiction in and of itself. But what was happening was that there were Iranian women who were Muslim, devoted to the Islam, devoted to the Islamic Republic, and they still wanted women's equality. During the Iran-Iraq war, it was the widows of the martyrs of the war who were the first women who went to the courts and demanded their equal rights. Because when they drafted the new constitution, it was women were dealt with as second-class citizens. They had, and they still don't have rights in custody of children, the right to divorce. They have to get their permission of their husbands to travel and so forth. But at the heart of it was the women's rights issues within the family. And it was in this particular topic that the widows of the martyrs became active, because they were now facing a reality. They were widows and they didn't have much right, and their rights were denied by the state. Now, in 1997, Khatami was elected, and hopes were high for gender equality. There were glimpses of change. Women entered the Azadi Stadium to watch soccer. High numbers of female journalists were employed by what is now called reformist newspapers. The conservatives were active through Majlis. They tried to pass bills that were favorable to gender equality. And particularly, it was the 6th Majlis who tried to pass gender equality bills.